I want to thank those of you who have stuck with us for the entire day. It's been a long day, but a lot of very thoughtful discussions and a lot of very interesting cases, as well as early empirical evidence on the program. Also want to thank those that are joining us online for being with us today as well. This panel is not going to be about case presentations or really any formal presentations. This session is to take a step back and think about what we've learned and what the implications are for the path forward from here on assuring that the breakthrough therapy designation is as effective as possible. And we've had a lot of discussion today about experiences so far, about perspectives from product developers, the FDA, academic experts, patient advocates, and others. And what I'd like to do today is, what I'd like to do in this session is put that all back together into discussion of some of the key themes that have emerged and also some practical next steps for moving forward on using the breakthrough designation effectively. So no presentations. I'm going to jump right into some questions and discussions with the panelists, and we have a great panel assembled for this last session. So I'm going to start off by introducing them. First, at the far end on your left is Dr. Karen Van Ballen, Head of Global Regulatory Affairs at Janssen Pharmaceuticals. Next to Karen is Dr. Kay Holcomb, the Senior Vice President for Science Policy at the Biotechnology Industry Association, BIO. Also with us, and next to Kay, is Dr. Peter Marks, the Deputy Director for the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research at FDA, which, as you've heard earlier, has been involved in a number of the breakthrough designations as well. Next to me is Dr. Gerald Dalpon, the Director of the Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology at FDA. On my left, to your right, Dr. Rich Masiski. Thank you, Rich, for being back up with us on the panel today. Next to Rich is Dr. Jeff Allen, the Executive Director of Friends of Cancer Research, who, as you've heard from Ellen Siegel in her modest way earlier, was highlighting Jeff's critical role in developing the legislative foundations and the thought foundations for the breakthrough therapy designation. And on your right end, Dr. Rachel Sherman, who currently is a principal for drug and biological drug products at Greenleaf Health, former senior official at FDA, and very much involved in the whole process of developing and applying the breakthrough designations with her leadership in medical policy and other areas at FDA. So I want to thank all of you for being with us this afternoon. And I'd like to make sure that you all say what you think is most important, but just to get the discussion going, I want to start with Karen and Kay and ask you all about, from today's discussion, from what you've known. I know both of you have been very much involved in breakthrough designation issues for quite some time now. Any key points that you think, especially based on these new developments, that drug developers should take away from the discussion on how to use the breakthrough process most effectively? We had some discussion earlier about how valuable the extra attention and focus can be, especially early on, for accelerating the development process and gaining more clarity. But as we also discussed, we need to be careful about how much of a resource drain this program could create. And eventually, John, I'll get back to your question of where should the bar be, but I want to warm up to that a little bit with some of these next step discussions, including for industry. So Karen, do you mind starting?
Okay, yeah, so we agreed between Kay and myself that I would start. So I'm the head of regulatory affairs at Janssen, and we have many experiences, and I found today very informative and instructive listening to the data that FDA has shared with us, as well as the case studies. So we have a number of breakthrough designations that were granted. We also have a case that has been denied. And our experience is overwhelmingly positive, both in terms of the designation process as well as the development assistance that we are getting during the process of those breakthrough designated products. We did talk about the denial, and the denial in our case was around a compound where we were overly ambitious about the preliminary piece of the definition. So we had a very small sample size, and that was indeed the feedback that we got from the agency. But as mentioned also by others during the conversation today, even that denial has helped us a lot to, first of all, understand the criteria better, and so we had subsequent better submissions, but also we got very valuable feedback on that particular compound that we are still developing. So from the resource perspective from the agency, we want to acknowledge that even that denial has certainly given us good development input. I want to comment on the point that was made this morning that we as companies should have self-control and not submit everything and anything. And I want to assure that we do have a diligent process also in our company, because we want to use our own resources effectively too, and denial would not be success in our case either. So I think there's a lot in terms of the learning, and what I've heard today, which I think is very good, is that we should maybe have some of those pre-breakthrough conversations at the time of the IND, so that we don't have submissions that are not proving valuable. So we have submissions in oncology and in psychiatry. Clearly in oncology it has helped us to speed up the development process substantially, but that has cost us also some of the other issues that were already mentioned. So the critical part becomes the planning of the inspections, as was mentioned. Also the CMC requirements, especially for large molecules, become the critical part. And so we have had those conversations with the agency, and we see that the cross-functional discussion is actually critical to make this all successful. Beyond even the drug development process, what we have also found is that if you develop a companion diagnostic at the same time, so that the pace of that development should also be aligned. So it's even beyond CDER, CBER. We have experiences where actually also the CDRH conversations have to happen. In the psychiatry experience, it's a lot about the depth and of the conversations, and so that helps us in having better inputs in our development plans. The senior leaders of the agency are present and very committed, likewise in oncology. So to the question whether the bar is too low, we don't think so. I think that we agree with the agency that the medicines that we bring should be transformative, and then I guess the criteria that we use in terms of that substantial or transformative potential is indeed what does the patient need, and I think that's where we in our company, what drives us, and I'm very pleased with the reference that was made to the Janssen statement that indeed the patients are waiting.
Thanks, Karen.
So at BIO, we hear a lot from our companies, especially our small companies, about their interest in this program. And one of the things that drives their interest is that this program offers them an opportunity for what they consider to be crucial to their success, which is interaction with the FDA in depth. And there are some things that this workshop highlighted that I believe bringing back to our BIO member companies will help them a lot. One of those things is the comment that was made on one of the panels earlier about the importance of reaching out to FDA in advance of submitting the first breakthrough application to get some idea, even though I recognize the advice from FDA is not binding and the company can submit anyway and all of those things. But reaching out to FDA and saying, this is what we have, what do you think, is a great idea. And I think that companies that don't regularly interact with regulators don't understand that you actually can do that. So that was an important learning that I can bring back to our bio-member companies from this workshop. I also did want to point out to John Jenkins that companies are never unrealistically optimistic. Their products all are breakthroughs. Some are just more breakthrough than others. I do think that it was important to hear what the reviewers said and the understandings that companies gained from their experience with FDA about the meaning of a substantial improvement in the treatment of patients. What does that actually mean? And honestly, all kidding aside, if we didn't believe as companies that our drugs were going to make a substantial improvement in patients' lives, we wouldn't develop them. So we do believe that. It's just how we define it versus how it's defined as being a breakthrough. And I agree with Karen that, and we agree at Bio, that breakthrough therapies should, as John Jenkins once said to us, knock your socks off. They should be transformative. They should make a huge difference in the lives of patients. And even though we all are working to that goal every day, we know we don't achieve that goal with every single product, that every single product is transformative. I think another learning from this workshop was the discussion and the examples that showed that you can't really exactly pinpoint that moment that you're not too early, because there were examples where people came in after phase 1, there were examples where people came in early phase 2, and there were examples, obviously, where people were in phase 3, and then, of course, there were some very early examples where the products were almost approved by the time they got the designation. So I think that what companies need to understand is it isn't about that moment in time. It is about that moment in the quality of the information that you are able to submit to the FDA. If you have really good data at phase 1, then it's not too early. So I think that's an important learning from this workshop. I think that the question of, and we discussed this a little bit offline, the question of the kinds of endpoints that the agency considers valuable in terms of defining substantial improvement is also very important. I think we all think of, and we talked a little bit about this morning, an oncology drug that works and doesn't kill you instantly is a substantial improvement. And it's obvious because cancer has terrible symptoms and it makes people very sick. But psychiatric drugs are kind of a different kind of problem. A psychiatric condition may not make you physically ill. It makes your life horrible. And that is also a condition that if we can improve that condition substantially, we're making an important difference in patients' lives. So different kinds of endpoints are also acceptable in this breakthrough therapy context. So I personally, and I think on behalf of Bio, think that this workshop has just been a tremendous eye-opener, and we are all going to learn a lot from this, which doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to reduce the applications. And let me just close by saying, if we send more applications, we have to send money with them. Right, John? I'm kidding, everyone. Don't all right, if that appears in the pink sheet, I am fired.
Well, we'll come back to, I'm sure we'll be coming back to that issue. Thank you both for those perspectives on some industry takeaways from the discussion, some important industry takeaways from the discussion today. I'd like to turn to Peter and Gerald next with a similar kind of frame question, more from the FDA perspective. I'd like to just hear from you about some of your top-line thoughts from the discussion today, important insights for FDA, and maybe some ideas about what FDA might do a little bit differently to help this program succeed even more going forward.
Okay, so thank you, Mark. I'm here because I'm a member of the Medical Policy Council, so since the program began, I've reviewed with my colleagues on the Council all the requests for breakthrough therapy designation. And first, I'd like to thank our presenters today, because I think this gave me personally a window on the program that you don't quite have when you're reviewing the applications every week or every 2 weeks at a meeting. And it underscored for me some of the challenges that the review divisions and the companies have. I think that when there are diseases or conditions for which there are established therapies, it generally means that there are established outcome measures, clinical trial, design standards, scales, et cetera, and measures of clinically meaningful effect that people can readily understand. I think Ron Farkas today brought out some of the challenges we have in developing or making decisions on breakthrough designation requests when it's a very rare disease, it's not been studied before, there's no agreed upon outcome measure or scale, and you get an application or a designation request, and there's a certain effect size, and you ask yourself, is this real? Is this meaningful? Does this have the substantial benefit that Kay was talking about before? And I don't think there's an easy solution to that, but I think that's where we're going to have to be paying some more attention in the future. So I'll leave it at that and let Peter jump in.
So, no, I thank you for organizing this again today. I think just so that people know, from the standpoint of Center for Biologics, we actually do somewhat stay in coordination with the Center for Drugs in that though we're not members of the Medical Policy Council, we listen in on their discussion, so we try to make sure that what we do is aligned. That being said, we work in the world of kind of the more complex biologics, gene therapies, cell-based therapies. Often, but not exclusively, those therapies are addressing relatively smaller populations, rare diseases, and toward that end, I think today's case from Bluebird Bio illustrated this, that sometimes very small populations can lead to the breakthrough designation, and what seems to, at least the places where we see the key focal points needing to be, at least for the products that we deal with, have to do with having consistent manufacturing processes, because we can't judge a product when it's been made 3 different ways for 3 different patients, because we don't know whether it can be made the same way for the 4th patient. So consistent manufacturing, consistent treatment algorithms, because for many of these therapies, they're only a component of the treatment algorithm. For instance, you have to give some type of conditioning or immunosuppressant so that the cell-based therapy is accepted. And if you do that differently each time, we can't evaluate that. And then carefully considered endpoints, because I think Bluebird Bio is a good example, very clear endpoint. If somebody needs 2 units of blood every 2 weeks and then they don't, we don't actually need the statisticians for that, unfortunately. And so those are the 3 major things that I would say that have come, that I think that we can say from the Center for Biologics perspective, that really it's not so much the numbers in the trial, it's that the product is consistently made, consistently applied, and then we have an endpoint that we can look at.
Thanks, Peter. Rich, I'm going to come back to you, but I want to get a couple other perspectives first. Next I'd like to go to Jeff. And, you've been, as I said, you've been involved with this program from before the beginning. And so you've had a chance to see its impact, particularly in the area of oncology care, but I know you've been tracking this overall. From the standpoint of patient and disease advocacy groups, what do you see as the big lessons and insights at this point for how to use this program as effectively as possible in the future?
Yeah, so I think it's been a great meeting and very insightful, and thanks to the organizers and all the participants who took a lot of effort to go into all of these case studies, which I think were a great way to conduct the meeting. I think early on, in terms of looking at what potentially a program like this could add, there was some debate about how much earlier interaction or intense interactions with FDA would help improve the then current state of drug development. And come to find out today, early interaction is what is needed, it sounds like. Probably not a formal program for that, though. I think it's great to see, the use of this, both from the applicants being interested in it and feeling like this is making a difference, and of course, from the FDA standpoint of, the shared desire to really expedite development. And so I think generally that's great. Obviously there's a few areas that still need work. It's been highlighted today about the role of companion diagnostics in many of these applications. Manufacturing has come up consistently throughout the day. And that's a project we've been talking about with FDA, and in June are having a public meeting on best practices for CMC and drug quality verifications to help move that discussion along. I guess after listening to the discussion today, one thing that isn't entirely clear is, would there be situations where retrospective analysis may apply? And it wasn't discussed here, but at a scientific meeting not too long ago, a case study was presented about, it was in regards to metastatic colon cancer, where the study didn't meet its primary endpoints, which was highlighted earlier on as we should not necessarily be digging to save one of these studies. But it was interesting because in that case, there was 30% of patients saw an increase of 3 months in overall survival. And I'm not saying that the decision was wrong to not grant that therapy breakthrough, but in the conference, and there was mixed feelings about whether that represented something transformational. So I don't raise that as an example where maybe something wasn't done accurate. It probably was entirely accurate, but it does raise the question: what if you did see a legitimate subpopulation that really represented a transformational effect? Given that this isn't an approval, is there room to find signals from that could be transformative? Since we've seen there are situations where a breakthrough can't necessarily be planned for, and it just sort of comes about. I think the one thing that may not necessarily be relevant to the designation, so I won't spend too much time on it, but it's something that isn't frequently brought up in discussing the program as a whole. And one of the final bullets in the legislation was around, that one of the intents of the program should be to minimize patient exposure to a less efficacious drug. And that was really the source of looking at breakthrough, where there were no effective treatments. And it will be interesting, I think, as the program plays out and we're seeing more approvals, to try and get to understand if that factors into the experimental designs, as the program was intended. But I'll stop there. I think, like I said, I think the progress is great to see. It's going to be inevitable, I suppose, which isn't great news for the workload on FDA, that people are going to apply as early as possible for this. And hopefully that's a good thing, because I think the goal of the program is to try and get those true breakthroughs in early, when the most enhancements can be made to the future development.
Or if not application, at least early discussion to get a clear understanding of whether it's appropriate or not. So, Rachel, you've had a unique perspective on this program. You were at FDA when the legislation was being developed. You were at FDA when the program was being implemented. Now you're outside. You had a chance to hear some of the perspectives today. So I'll turn to you for some comments about where to go from here.
Well, first, thank you. I'm very pleased to be included because I do have a soft spot for this program, and I think it is true that without Jeff and his colleagues and friends, it would not exist. I'd like to start off by picking a fight with Bob Temple, because that's one of my most favorite things to do, and say that. But Mark, don't worry, it does actually apply. So I mean, the overarching takeaway from today is the program is a success. I don't think we should miss that point. So what started out legislatively, because we are approaching another legislative, or we're in the midst of another legislative swirl, what started out as a wholesale, if you will, attack on the efficacy standard turned out to be an enormous win for patients and a wonderfully useful tool at promoting dialogue between the agency and companies. But Bob, I would say that Subpart E was aggressively implemented by the Division of Antiviral, what was the drug products, or now antiviral products, since, I think Bob's agreeing with me instead of fighting with me. Oh, this is more fun. But anyway, so just as Fast Track in 98-ish was an attempt to instantiate, make more widely used or utilized a program that was known to some and implemented by some. Breakthrough is very, very similar. And John, to your point about what the bar is, I would say that's one question, although we haven't heard anything today to suggest that the bar is totally being missed. But I would just ask us to think for a moment about the question of incentives, because that was brought up at the last panel, and a comparison was made with the GAIN Act. The GAIN Act is an economic incentive program, period. It has nothing to do with drug development, but it's not supposed to impact the development program, the trajectory of the development program. Breakthrough is intended specifically to impact the trajectory of the development program and expedite those knock your socks off or home run things that we couldn't put in the legislation because those are not legislative terms, but that's what we all meant, right? So if we think about that, and then I think we need to respect utilizing breakthrough as it was intended. And so, Mark, you talk about the fact that I have two perspectives, and I do, and that's been actually fascinating. So for the first number of months of the Breakthrough program, Sandy Benton, who was my special assistant, and I spent over half hour a week on Breakthrough, literally, until we just couldn't do that anymore. So it's an enormous, and that's just two people of the many that were involved. So if there's a flood of breakthrough applications because they're viewed as a way to communicate with the agency when there are other ways to communicate with an agency, or they're a way to potentially circumvent what should be the primary contact, which is the review division, then that's not a good use of breakthrough. But if it's used as intended, which is we're really excited about this product, we think it has real potential and real promise, and we want to have that conversation, then I think maybe we're hitting, in general, we're hitting the bar at the right place, which is we hope, a paradigm-changing product. And I think we all expect that not all breakthrough products would turn out to be breakthrough, and that would it would be odd if they all, in fact, were approved in the end, retain their breakthrough status. I think another important point that was made was that if it genuinely appears to be a breakthrough and then is not, the denial letters, the denial discussions can be very useful for the overarching trajectory of the development plan. So, and the final point that I did not appreciate fully at the agency, but I have started to appreciate outside the agency, is that little companies who are trying to do really good work with really interesting products need some way to fund that work. And at the agency, when it was we did appreciate that, but I did at least not appreciate the amount of time that these companies have to spend trying to stay alive. And while breakthrough should not be a means of, if you will, fundraising, if indeed it not only helps attract the community attention and certainly help expedite the program and therefore decrease the overall cost and time, but if it does help them attract and retain funding for crucial programs, well, that's a nice side benefit as well.
Rachel, thanks, and maybe pick up on some of this, Rich, with you. So I asked earlier about what should FDA and others do differently based on your experiences so far and what's been discussed today. I would like to maybe make this a little bit more pointed in that, let's face it, people like this program. It's gotten pretty positive reviews all the way around, and they like it for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is the opportunity for early and relatively senior and coordinated contact throughout the agency to clarify issues that are not just FDA issues, but really development science issues, issues for the companies as well, and how they go from a product that seems like it could be knock your socks off, transformative one to demonstrating that it really is. And I think the statistics, including the ones we've talked about today, look pretty good, not just in terms of take up, but in terms of lower development times. And we're talking not like a month or two, but potentially years. Yeah, and that's hugely important to patients. On the other hand, that's also become clear today that this is taking a good deal of senior and other resources at FDA. Rachel was just talking about her own time there, spending a lot of effort, and like Rachel time, that was like really valuable at FDA. I remember that. I had when I was there, we had this term, efficient risk management that we use, which is basically just a nice way of saying, look, FDA doesn't have the resources to do everything, so we're going to prioritize. And another way of formulating John's question earlier is, with limited resources, what's the best way to use this program? So I'm not necessarily asking you to answer that tough question, but would like to hear about your perspectives on what seems to be working best and how to move this program forward, given sort of limited resources. When you face those kinds of constraints, there are always two things to do. One is, we can restrict it more. You just limit the cases when we use it, and that might mean set the bar higher, as we've talked about earlier. The other is try to find a way to do it more efficiently. So can we accomplish goals like early interaction with companies that don't know how to proceed in a particular area? Is there another mechanism for handling that? Jeff was saying he didn't want to set up yet another accelerated pathway. I'm sure FDA is not ready for another one of those right now either. Or is there another way to get down? It seems like there is a lot of activity going into breakthrough applications that are denied, which seems like leaves room for improvement on the in terms of efficient use of breakthrough designation. So you can answer whichever part of that you want.
Yeah, a bit far-ranging there,
Yeah.
Mark, but I think actually those themes have come out during our discussion today. And I think I'll start maybe with the last of your comments or questions first. And that's, we have the purpose today, right, was to help the sponsors and industry really understand what it is we're looking for, so that they understand better what to submit. And so I think this is a major step forward, I hope, and it'll be interesting to track whether the ratio of granted versus denied changes after this meeting as people begin to think more carefully and answer our ask of self-control in terms of what they would submit, and reduce the amount of time that in the end doesn't produce anything when something's denied. Although I guess I'm hearing that it does produce something, it does give some direction to people, and so it's not really wasted time. The fact that we have more than 80 programs now designated as breakthrough, I think is very significant in terms of thinking about where the bar should be. That's a lot. I mean, that's a lot of programs that we want to have all hands on deck. And in fact, I think it's going to be more and more and more, because even though we are asking you to exercise this self-control, I think industry is changing itself and is itself looking for breakthroughs more and more in their own pipelines and how they're approaching their portfolios. I think, you know, the age of Me Too's is slowly kind of going away. You know, I think the payer system is probably driving much of that thinking process. So we are going to see legitimate, bona fide breakthroughs coming through, I think, more and more, particularly as the science in certain areas starts to catch up with the kind of science we have in oncology. So I do think we're going to have to give great thought to this. And I do think we have mature areas like oncology where all the factors that Gerald was talking about, you know, are well outlined. And then we have these areas of very deep unmet need where there really is nothing and where there is great desperation on the parts of patients for something, anything, that we think really can make a difference. And here I think it's a matter of context. It's not that where there's nothing, anything is of some good and should be a breakthrough. I think there are, we're going to have to think very carefully that it has to mean still something to people. And if it's a disease-modifying therapy, you know, you only have a certain short time maybe to measure a change, but that little change in a short time could make a huge change in the lifetime of a patient. And so that's where maybe something can make a really big difference in the long run. Whereas if you have something that's just changing a symptom, and you only change a symptom by a little bit, you know, let's say you decrease pain and they take one less pain pill a day, that may not be necessarily a breakthrough, even though there was nothing else available for that kind of a treatment. I think that perhaps the message that comes through all day long was communication. And so, you know, I do think that making sure that companies that are small and don't have a lot of experience and companies that do have a lot of experience have the ability to get some input in what they're considering. I think it will save us resources by doing that, and it will certainly save the company resources by having that kind of early communication in what we're all trying to do. You know, I guess closing thoughts a little bit, I would say that I just would reiterate what we said earlier about making sure that the data has good quality that is in its submission, and we talked about a number of factors there, and that we truly believe that we have a substantial improvement, and we've talked a lot about the factors that come into play with that. So maybe I'll stop there and we could go to other questions.
Thanks, Rich. Let me turn back to the panel to see after this discussion any other points that you want to add, and then I want to open this up to comments and questions from all of you. So if you have any, please head up to the microphone. Peter, go ahead.
I actually just would say that, I think one of the things that we can say about breakthrough is that, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say that a measure of its success is how it is actually changing the landscape of how we think about the drug development process. And I think it's actually refocusing the science of drug development onto the science itself and off of the regulatory process a little bit, to the extent that if you compare 10 years ago to now that a lot of the regulatory process is becoming more well-defined, there's more interaction, that hurdle is decreasing. And I think some of this is now refocusing on the science, biomarkers, clinical trial designs, so that I think it's a tribute, I think, to the success of this that can happen.
One of the I'm sorry, go ahead, Karen.
I just want to make one comment to show how we feel that there's actually a culture change, that in the past the companies would come forward with a proposal and the agency would react to that, and if the agency saw an issue or a risk, they would call us to raise that. Now we have experienced that the agency is calling us to discuss an opportunity to how to move forward faster. So that kind of collaboration for us has been a big eye-opener and a culture shift.
You know, that communication point is very important, and this picks up on Peter's comment as well, that you know, if you think about measures of success here, and we talked about some, one is that comes out of this discussion is getting the number of denials down as something that should be tracked and be an indicator of whether people really do understand the criteria and are acting effectively based on that. But as also the case in other areas of healthcare reform, people like to say what gets measured is what gets addressed, and a lot of the measures around drug development in the past, say 5 or 10 years ago, were really focused on things like you're saying, Peter, like review times, and it's great to get that down by a couple of months or something like that. But what we're seeing in this program, and I think it is worth measuring more systematically, is development times getting reduced by a couple of years, or the number of patients required for testing getting substantially reduced, or the number of patients, as Jeff was saying, going to be a great measure, exposed to treatments that are turn out not to be effective being substantially reduced. That is a refocus in measurement that I think hasn't really happened to the extent that people are talking about today, where the culture is headed, and might be an important part of keeping attention on making sure this program is focused effectively and the criteria for it are well understood. I see some nodding, but any other thoughts about what we ought to be measuring if we really want to make sure that the breakthrough designation and the understanding of the criteria and the way the criteria are set is being done as effectively as possible?
Sure. Well, I think once we have designated something a breakthrough, it's important to say how many continue to bear out that promise and look at the number of these that actually get approved, not just the time it takes to get them approved, but both are really interesting measures that I think will tell us a lot about this program. If, in fact, we're right, if, in fact, these are really breakthroughs, when we see them early, I think that will itself, whether the process of all hands on deck changes things, the very nature of a breakthrough itself allows us to move in a very fast way, because, the treatment effects should be large. It should be easily measurable, in smaller samples. I think oncology's been great at even doing single-arm trials, because we know that large effect is so different from the expected effect that sometimes even the need for longer controlled trials may be less in this setting. So I think there's a lot of reasons to anticipate success.
I think another thing, and I just wanted to pick up, Karen mentioned this earlier, on this, the problems that companies sometimes have at the end with manufacturing. So they have a breakthrough therapy designation, they have an expedited review, they get to the end, they're going to be approved, and they can't make the drug, or they can't make it according to specifications. And it's one of the things that we would like to work with other stakeholders and FDA to figure out if there's a way that we can keep that from happening. Especially, my heart was warmed by John talking about how FDA is now working to make a direct link between the breakthrough therapy designated products and an expedited pathway. So if this is a barrier, this is a hurdle at the end, we need to figure out how to deal with it more effectively.
And Jeff, you mentioned that point too, and also the point about validation of any companion diagnostic or marker that is going along with many of these new targeted breakthrough products. you might want to comment on that, or you might have a comment on how we know if we're succeeding or making further progress and applying criteria effectively.
Yeah, one thing I just wanted to go back to the comments on culture, and I think, this is an FDA Brookings meeting, and I think it's, it's very easy to look at, has culture at FDA changed, but I don't think that's the sole intent here. One of the things that's been discussed in establishing the program is having this be somewhat a culture change within the companies as well. To basically, say that as opposed to historic drug development, which was a little bit more, try it in a few patients. If you start to see something, try it in a few more and just kind of inch your way along. To shift culture a little bit and say, if you're willing to, design your studies a little bit differently, swing for the fences a bit more, maybe randomize early to get the answers, then you'll be rewarded by having this system in place that the FDA is really going to be there to work for you. It might be a bigger risk to do those studies earlier, but then there's a little bit more of a payoff. So it's not just culture at FDA. I think that should be measured here. I think very importantly, it's the culture of how the design of studies might be shifting.
That's an extremely important point because it was eye-opening. Some of the first designations that we discussed where the divisions were reaching out and saying, it's a small number of patients. Why is it going to take you a year to get them to us? Or I know in the case of antivirals, reaching out to try and expedite an HCV product, those are now cures. But I think, Rich, I'll agree with you now that I argued with Bob, I don't think there should be a 100% success rate or maybe even a 50% success rate. I think what we really want to measure, Mark, is that the requests, the designation requests are appropriate. Janet Woodcock famously has said, drugs always look best before they go into people, right? And the idea of this program is to get to the development program as early as possible to minimize patients exposed to ineffective therapy, to expedite to speak to the chemist and say, why do you need 12 months of stability data for a drug that's intended to treat a disease with 1,200 people and that's killing them immediately? I mean, these are real-life examples, both within the company and within the agency. But I think if we looked at all the submissions and we felt that they were reasonable, even if some of them weren't granted, or if some of them were granted and they ultimately proved not to be a breakthrough, then I think we should be happy. And just one other pitch. This was a well-written piece of legislation. Therefore, as difficult and time-consuming and resource-intensive as it was to implement, it wasn't a nightmare. Unlike others, biosimilars comes to mind. And so just a plea to those who are involved in the legislative swirl that targeted, not, if you pardon me, non-micromanaging, but
you can say whatever you want.
Okay, non-micromanaging, implementable legislation. We learned a lot from this. Naming something, whether, no pun on biosimilars, naming something, whether or not FDA needed additional authority really helped create a program. So there's a huge lesson to be learned from that, just as we look forward to the next however many months.
Just thanks, Rachel. And for those of you who are following along on the agenda, you see that we're into the phase where I'm supposed to be talking about next steps in my closing remarks. We are talking about next steps, obviously, and it's a lot more fun, at least for me, listening to getting this group to talk about next steps than my doing it. So we are going to end on time. If there are any last questions or comments, now is the time. But I did want to follow up further on this point about communication, since that's really coming across as very important. And the breakthrough designation has been very helpful for that process, but one way to see today's meeting is about getting clarity about what constitutes, not just what constitutes a breakthrough, but also what constitutes the answers to the questions that companies that are seeking a breakthrough designation could get, maybe without going through the whole breakthrough process. And what I mean by that is this is effective communication, Rich, but it's very much, sort of individual company FDA staff focus. So it's harder, at least at the time, for other companies that are working in similar areas, or as we heard earlier, NIH and others, maybe to take advantage of all of those discussions. Now, for the breakthrough products that are eventually approved, the details come out, people know about the study design issues and the endpoints and so forth. But some of the questions that we heard, especially in the areas where there aren't treatments now, are really probably common to a lot of companies that are either in the area, maybe thinking about getting into the area, and just don't know what's coming along. Often the way that FDA deals with this is through issuing some kind of guidance, but it's hard to do that, and as the reason, as John pointed out earlier this morning, that a lot of today was focused on case studies, and as came out in the results presented this morning, is that you can't just come up with a simple list of, do this, don't do that, here's exactly where the bar is in this case. It's, as people said repeatedly, it's sort of the totality of the experience. And I'm not sure we're there yet in terms of how much of what's currently being handled through individual breakthrough designation interactions is best handled that way versus some more general findings. And maybe a next step, too, for both FDA and companies working with them is to see if we can build up that common understanding about where the bar is, about what the processes for the methods for showing effectiveness could be in a way that goes beyond individual cases. I don't know if, I know companies don't want to see necessarily see their own individual experience highlighted as a denial, but the results that FDA presented today collectively on denials this morning and on sort of these pseudo case studies that brought together a lot of the characteristics of denial, I think are very helpful to have out there and in providing more clarity about the criteria for breakthrough and about the criteria for developing a drug effectively.
Well, it certainly seemed that putting together today's meeting and writing up a summary and publishing it would be a very useful next step and very helpful to the broader field, considering a follow-up meeting a year from now to, again, have another look back at what's changing, where are we going, what's been successful, might also be another way to go. I think one could even think of the possibility of having information put on the FDA website around breakthroughs that were granted and some of the reasons why they were granted, which if the sponsors were willing to allow us to do something like that, I think might also be extremely helpful for people to follow in real time what's going on.
Thank you. Question?
Andrew L. Nathan here. Since we're talking about next steps, is there any move towards forming a joint medical policy council for both CBER and CEDAR? Because this is the first time that I've heard from Peter Marks that CBER doesn't sit on the MPC.
We can talk through this. I think we have different products. We think we're in alignment with the Center for Drugs in terms of how we go about things, and we have a group that sits down and discusses these. It's not quite as large as the Medical Policy Council, but since we're a fifth the size of the Center for Drugs, it's probably proportionally sized. But your point's well taken, and I think it's something we can go back and think about. Thank you.
Any other final comments from the panel? Final thoughts on John's question, is the bar at the right place? I have to say, John, I didn't hear a unified answer to that question today.
Can I try? Can I try again? John, because we thought there were three buckets, right? The easy yes, the easy no, and the ones in the middle. And the ones in the middle were really hard. And so I personally think that, at least in my experience when I was at the agency, that the bar was at the right place, because those were pretty lively and pretty split discussions. And so if they've continued it there, I think the bar probably is at the right place. I think we predicted that there would be an upswing in denials because so the first programs that come through, we felt there would be a bolus of things, sort of really good ones, if you will, just waiting. And then there would be an attractiveness about the program, so there would be an upswing in denials. And I think the next thing that we might want to look at is whether the denials taper, and they should go down a little.
They should come down, although, again, the results this morning, not huge numbers. It was looking pretty steady over the first couple of years, but this is still early experience, yeah.
Well, I think then it also boils down to resources. If we think the bar's in the right place, and we think that this is going to continue, and that we will have bona fide agents coming through that certainly deserve breakthrough, as we move into our next round of discussions on PDUFA, I think there hopefully will be some recognition that this could benefit greatly, and the public health and patients might benefit greatly from making sure we have the resources to continue to drive these forward fast.
And if I could add one more thing now from an outside perspective, again, if companies can be very careful about respecting the process and starting with the review division, because if they have that conversation and it's not looking likely, then that will help. If, on the other hand, it's I don't want to say abused, but used as a tool for something else, a tool to pick up the phone and get the janitor, Rich or Bob or John on the phone instead of the review division, then those resources are not spent well, and it's not going to be supportable.
I want to thank our panel. Before you all applaud, there are a few other things that I want to get in first. So I'm not going to try to briefly summarize next steps. I think you all did a terrific job of laying out some of those in terms of making sure that the material from this meeting is available, which I think can be very helpful to everyone who's concerned about breakthrough treatments, possible follow-ups, including a summary, and hopefully that study presented this morning that Cedar developed will get published. I think that's a really valuable piece of work in itself. Some further steps on how to measure progress about whether the program is well understood and is having the maximum impact possible, and other next steps as well. I do want to thank not just the panel, but all of you who came together today. This was the preparation for this meeting and the discussions that we had, I think, exemplify the kind of communication and interaction that many have found so valuable about the breakthrough program itself, in terms of serious discussion of challenging issues where there may not be simple bright line rules, but where there is an opportunity for more clarity and more progress. I want to thank especially the members of the planning committee from these diverse perspectives who helped put this together, and especially the FDA staff who are very busy with lots of things, including dealing with a large number of breakthrough applications and designations, but also found time to take a step back and think about where we are and how the program can be better understood in the outside world and can go forward effectively. We're obviously not done, but I think an important step here towards bringing better treatments to patients faster. And last, I want to give special thanks to the staff at Brookings who helped put this together, including Greg Daniel, Craig Streit, Joanna Klassman, Matthew Longo, and Liz Richardson. Terrific job on all of this. So thank you all for joining us today, and thanks in advance for further progress around breakthrough therapies. Have a good afternoon.